howled across the empty valley as night slowly covered the mountains. James Walker sat alone inside his small wooden cabin. The fire crackled quietly in the stone fireplace, throwing warm light across the rough walls. He had lived in these mountains for 12 years now, long enough for silence to feel normal. Some nights he didn't speak a single word. The nearest town sat nearly 15 miles away, and very few travelers ever passed through the narrow trail near his cabin. James didn't mind the isolation. People had only brought trouble in the past. But winter had come early that year, and the snow outside already covered the ground in thick, white layers. The temperature kept dropping, and the wind sounded sharper with every passing hour. James placed another log into the fire and leaned back in his chair. He stared into the flames, remembering the quiet rhythm of his life. Wake up, chop wood, check the traps, repair the cabin, sleep, then repeat. The fire popped suddenly, breaking his thoughts, and then he heard it, a soft knock. James froze. Out here, a knock at night was rare. He slowly stood up and walked toward the door. The wind rattled the wooden walls again. He opened the door carefully. A young woman stood outside, half covered in snow. Her coat looked thin, and her dark hair was wet from the falling flakes. Her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she shivered. "Sir," she whispered weakly, "may I warm up by your fire?" James stared at her for a moment. She looked exhausted, like she had been walking for hours. The snow clung to her boots, and her lips trembled from the cold. He stepped aside without another word. "Come in." The woman hurried inside and stood close to the fire. She stretched her hands toward the warmth and closed her eyes for a moment, like the heat itself was saving her life. James closed the door behind her. "You walked far?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Too far." He grabbed a small kettle from the shelf and placed it over the fire. "Tea will help." The woman sat quietly on the wooden chair across from him. She looked around the cabin with cautious eyes, but there was relief on her face too. After a few minutes, the warmth returned to her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. James poured the tea and handed her a cup. "Name?" "Emily." He nodded once. "James." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside continued to roar against the mountains. Emily held the warm cup with both hands. "I didn't think anyone lived out here," she admitted. James shrugged. "Most don't." She hesitated before speaking again. "I was trying to reach the town before dark, but the snow started falling and I lost the trail." James studied her carefully. She looked no older than 20. Her clothes were worn, and her small bag sat beside her chair nearly empty. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. Emily looked down into the tea. "The city. That's 2 days away." "I know." The firelight flickered across her face. She seemed unsure how much to say. James waited patiently. Silence usually made people speak eventually. After a moment, Emily sighed. "I left because there was nothing left for me there." James leaned back slightly. "Trouble?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Isn't that usually the reason people run?" James didn't answer. He knew the feeling too well. Emily continued quietly. "My father died last year. Then the landlord took the house. I tried finding work, but things didn't go well." James noticed the way her voice tightened on those last words. He didn't ask more questions. In the mountains, people respected the spaces others weren't ready to share. He simply stood and grabbed a small pot from the shelf. "You eaten?" She shook her head slowly. "Not today." James poured some stew from the pot he had made earlier and handed her a bowl. Emily stared at the food like she wasn't sure it was real. Then she began eating slowly at first, but soon faster. James pretended not to notice. He stepped outside briefly to check the woodpile. The snow had grown heavier. When he came back inside, Emily had finished every last bite. She looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," James shook his head. "Food is meant to be eaten." The fire crackled warmly between them. For the first time since she arrived, Emily looked slightly relaxed. but James could still see worry in her eyes. "You planning to leave tonight?" he asked. She looked toward the window where snow now covered the glass. "I guess I have to." James studied the storm outside. Then he looked back at her. Her boots were soaked and her coat barely thick enough for the cold. If she tried to walk in that storm, she wouldn't make it far. He walked to the door and opened it. The wind pushed snow into the cabin instantly. He closed it again. "You're not going anywhere tonight." Emily blinked. "I don't want to cause trouble." James shook his head firmly. "That storm would kill you before morning." She stared at the fire quietly, like she was trying to decide something. Finally, she whispered, "Then I'll leave at sunrise." James sat down again, but after a moment he spoke words that surprised even himself. "You don't have to rush away." Emily looked up, confused. He stared into the fire before continuing. "This cabin has 2 rooms, and winter in these mountains is long." She waited silently for him to finish. Then he said the words that would change her life forever. "You can stay here until you figure out where you belong." Emily stared at him like she hadn't heard correctly. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. James looked uncomfortable with the emotion, but he didn't take the words back. Outside, the snowstorm continued to bury the mountain trail deeper and deeper. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady and warm. And Emily realized that the small knock she made on a stranger's door had just changed the path of her life. She sat quietly near the fire, still holding the empty bowl in her hands, trying to understand what had just happened. Only a few hours earlier, she had been alone in the freezing storm with nowhere to go. Now she was inside a warm cabin with a roof above her, and a stranger offering her something she had not felt in a long time: safety. James stood near the fireplace, pretending to fix the iron kettle hook, but the truth was he was simply thinking. He had spent more than a decade living alone in these mountains. Letting someone stay here, even for a short time, felt strange. But when he looked at Emily sitting by the fire with tired eyes and shaking hands, he knew sending her back into the storm would have been something he could never forgive himself for. Emily finally spoke softly. "I won't be a burden." James looked at her. "Didn't say you were." She placed the bowl on the small wooden table. "I can cook, clean, chop wood if you show me how." A faint smile touched James's face for the first time that night. "Chopping wood in winter is harder than it looks." Emily gave a small, determined nod. "Then I'll learn." The fire crackled quietly between them. The storm outside continued to roar, but inside the cabin the warmth slowly wrapped around the room like a blanket. James walked to the small hallway that led to the back of the cabin. "There's a spare room," he said. "It's small, but warm." Emily stood slowly and followed him. He opened the door, revealing a simple room with a narrow bed, a wool blanket, and a small wooden chest. It wasn't much, but compared to the freezing forest outside, it felt like a palace. Emily stepped inside carefully. She ran her fingers across the blanket like she couldn't believe it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. James nodded once and closed the door to give her privacy. That night, the storm buried the mountain trail deeper than anyone could remember. The wind screamed through the trees until morning. When the sun finally rose, the world outside the cabin had turned into a white ocean of snow. James stepped outside with a shovel and stared at the drifts piling against the walls. "Trail's gone," he muttered. He spent the next hour clearing the path to the woodpile. When he returned inside, he smelled something unexpected: food. Emily stood near the small stove, stirring a pot. She looked up nervously. "I found some oats and dried apples. I hope that's all right." James looked at the small bowls she had placed on the table. Then he looked back at her. "You didn't have to." Emily shrugged lightly. "You gave me a roof. Breakfast seemed fair." They sat down together and ate quietly. The cabin felt different that morning. Not loud, not crowded, just less empty. After breakfast, Emily followed James outside. He handed her a smaller axe. We'll start with lighter logs. She nodded seriously. The first few swings were awkward. The axe bounced off the wood once and nearly made her lose balance. James quickly steadied the log. "Slow down," he said patiently. "Strength isn't the trick. Timing is." After several tries, the axe finally split a small log cleanly in half. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. James chuckled softly. "See?" By afternoon, a small stack of wood sat beside the cabin. Emily wiped sweat from her forehead, even in the cold air. "I didn't think I could do that." James shrugged. "Most people can do more than they think." Days slowly passed. The storm blocked the trail for nearly a week. During that time, Emily helped with chores. She cooked simple meals, cleaned the cabin, and even learned how to repair small tools. James showed her how to check animal traps along the tree line. At first, the silence between them felt awkward, but slowly conversations started to grow longer. One evening, while they sat by the fire, Emily finally asked the question she had been holding back. "Why do you live out here alone?" James stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Used to have a family." Emily stayed quiet, letting him continue. "A wife and a little girl." His voice grew softer. Sickness took them both in the same winter. Emily felt her chest tighten. James added another log to the fire. After that, the mountains felt easier than people. The cabin fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was shared. A few days later, the snow finally began to melt. The narrow trail slowly appeared again through the trees. Emily stood outside the cabin, staring toward the distant valley. The road back to the world was open again. James walked up beside her. "Trail's clear now," he said quietly. She nodded slowly but didn't move. "You could reach the town by tomorrow." Emily looked down at her boots. She had thought about this moment many times during the past week, but now that it was here, something inside her felt uncertain. "If I left," she said carefully, "would this place feel empty again?" James didn't answer immediately. He looked at the mountains, the woodpile, the smoke rising from the chimney. Then he said something simple but honest. "It probably would." Emily took a deep breath, then she turned toward him. "Then maybe I shouldn't leave." James raised an eyebrow slightly. She smiled nervously. "You said I could stay until I figure out where I belong." James nodded slowly. "I did." Emily looked around the small cabin, the quiet trees, and the mountains glowing under the winter sun. "I think I might have already figured that out." For the first time in many years, the lonely mountain cabin no longer felt like a place where someone was hiding from life. It had quietly become a place where two broken paths had crossed and started building something new together.